At a luxury resort, one mix-up changed everything. She was just a hard-working employee. He was an untouchable tycoon. All it took was the wrong room and an unexpected morning for masks to fall and feelings to rise. What started as a mistake and turned into an act quickly blossomed into real love until a revelation put it all to the test. Get ready to fall in love with this surprising story of desire, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales. Charlotte Mitchell took a deep breath before knocking on the main office door. She nervously adjusted her white shirt's collar and smoothed her black blazer, making sure she looked impeccable. As executive assistant to Edward Vaughan, CEO of Nexus Technologies, one of the giants in the American tech market, she had learned that details made all the difference. "Come in," said a deep, authoritative voice from the other side. She opened the door and found Edward hunched over documents spread across his mahogany desk. He didn't immediately look up. "Good morning, sir. I've confirmed all the details for the trip to the Hamptons. The resort is reserved. Meetings with investors are scheduled, and the presentation has been revised according to your instructions." Edward finally looked up. At 38, with impeccably cut dark hair, penetrating brown eyes and a defined jawline, he was the personification of corporate success, elegant, assertive, and completely inaccessible. "The contract with the Japanese?" he asked directly. Translated. "Hand ready for final review. I emailed it 5 minutes ago." An almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. "Efficient as always, Charlotte." That was the most praise she could expect, and yet she felt a warmth rising up her neck. After 3 years working for Edward Vaughan, she still couldn't avoid feeling nervous in his presence. It wasn't just the intimidation he exerted over everyone in the company. It was something different, something she refused to name. "We'll leave at 6 a.m. Make sure you're punctually at the airport." "Yes, sir, I'll be there at 5:30. The silence that followed indicated the conversation was over. Charlotte turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Charlotte?" "Yes?" "This contract with the Japanese investors will define Nexus's future. We cannot make mistakes." She nodded, understanding the weight. Kimura Tech was willing to invest billions in Nexus's expansion into the Asian market. If everything went well, Edward's company would double in value overnight. "I understand, sir. I'll do everything as planned." The resort in the Hamptons was high spectacle in itself. Located on a hillside overlooking the sea, it combined luxury and discretion, the perfect environment for high-level negotiations. Charlotte watched fascinated as the receptionist explained the details of their stay. Edward, beside her, maintained his usual serious expression, only occasionally nodding. "Mr. Kimura and his team will arrive tomorrow morning," the receptionist informed them. "We've prepared the Atlantic room for the meetings as requested." "Excellent," replied Edward, taking his key. "Suite 710. Charlotte received her key next. "Room 512. They separated at the elevator, Edward heading to the 7th floor while Charlotte got off at the 5th. Her room was comfortable, although much smaller than the presidential suite reserved for her boss. She quickly unpacked and reviewed the documents for the next morning's meeting. That evening, Nexus executives gathered for dinner at the resort's restaurant. The atmosphere was one of controlled relaxation. Everyone knew they were there for work, but the tension decreased. "With each glass of wine, to our international expansion," toasted Marcus, the financial director, raising his glass. Everyone joined the toast. Charlotte drank moderately, aware that she needed to maintain her composure. However, after the 3rd toast, she noticed the wine was beginning to take effect. Her face was warm and her thoughts slightly blurred. Edward rarely participated in these moments of relaxation, preferring to keep his distance, observing. But that night, even he seemed more relaxed, allowing himself a few discreet smiles while listening to his director's stories. At one point, their gazes met across the table. For a brief moment, Charlotte saw something different in those usually controlled eyes. Was it vulnerability, or just the reflection of the wine in her own perception? When dinner ended, it was past midnight. The executives dispersed, some heading to the resort's bar, others to their rooms. Edward nodded discreetly to Charlotte before withdrawing. It was his silent way of saying, "Good job." Charlotte decided to stay a little longer. She chatted with some people from the marketing department, laughed at jokes that weren't even that funny, and accepted another glass of wine. She was nervous about the next day's meeting, and the alcohol seemed to ease her anxiety. When she finally decided to leave, it was almost 2 in the morning. The resort lobby was quiet, and she stumbled slightly as she walked to the elevator. The wine had definitely been too much. In the elevator, she had to concentrate to press the button for the 5th floor. The numbers seemed to blur before her tired eyes. When she reached her floor, she felt an overwhelming fatigue. Stumbling down the hallway, she looked for room 512. The numbers on the doors seemed too small, difficult to distinguish in her state of drunkenness and exhaustion. Finally, she found what she believed to be her room. She inserted the card into the lock, surprised to see it worked on the first try. The room was completely dark. She didn't bother turning on the lights. All she wanted was to collapse into bed. She took off her shoes, left her purse on what she imagined to be a table, and practically fell onto the soft mattress. It was only when she felt the different sinking of the mattress that something seemed strange. This one seemed more comfortable than the one in her room. But the fatigue was so great that the thought quickly dissipated. In seconds, she was already sleeping deeply. Edward Vaughan had always been a man of habits. Regardless of what time he went to bed, he invariably woke up at 5:30 a.m. That morning would be no different, except that, upon opening his eyes, he felt an unusual weight on his chest. A soft perfume, not his own, invaded his nostrils. And there was hair, long brown hair spread across his pillow. For a moment of pure shock, he remained completely still. Charlotte Mitchell, his executive assistant, was sleeping deeply beside him, with her arm delicately resting on his chest. Edward felt his heart accelerate. He tried to reconstruct the events of the previous night. He had drunk, yes, but not enough to lose control. Definitely not enough to invite his assistant to his bed. In fact, he clearly remembered retiring alone. With cautious movements, he removed her arm and got up from the bed. It was then that he noticed both were still fully clothed. He in the dress pants and shirt from dinner, she in the black dress she had worn the night before. "Charlotte," he called softly. There was no response. "Charlotte," he repeated, a little louder. She moved, mumbled something unintelligible, and nestled more into the pillow. Edward took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The situation was, at the very least, awkward. "Charlotte," he said, now in a normal tone. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking several times as if trying to recognize her surroundings. When her gaze finally focused on Edward's face, standing next to the bed, the confusion on her face quickly turned to horror. "Mr. Vaughan." Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "Good morning," he said with a calmness he didn't feel. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Charlotte sat up on the bed in a sudden movement, looking frantically around. This was not her room. It was much larger, much more luxurious. A suite. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, covering her mouth with her hands. Why, I don't understand." "Calm down," said Edward, handing her a glass of water that was on the bedside table. "From what I can tell, you entered the wrong room last night. This is 710, not 512. Understanding slowly illuminated Charlotte's pale face. The digits, she had inverted them in the confusion of the early morning, and her card worked on his door. How was that possible? "My card worked on your door?" she asked, trying to understand. "Probably some programming error at reception," replied Edward. Pragmatic as always. "It happens, albeit rarely." The silence that followed was suffocating. Charlotte looked at herself, still fully dressed, and then at Edward, equally dressed. "We didn't," she began, unable to complete the sentence. "No," he answered quickly. "We both fell into bed, exhausted. Nothing happened." The relief she felt was immense, but quickly replaced by a wave of shame. How would she explain this? How would she continue working normally after such a blunder? "Mr. Vaughan, I don't know what to say. I'm deeply embarrassed. I swear it wasn't intentional. I was confused and tired and—" "Charlotte," he interrupted firmly, but without aggression. It was a mistake, it happens. We don't need to turn this into something bigger than it really is. She nodded, still mortified. Now, I suggest you go to your room, take a shower, and get ready. We have the meeting with the Japanese in 2 hours. The Kiki. Mention of the meeting was like a bucket of cold water. The billion-dollar contract, the investors, everything that was at stake. How could she concentrate after this? Yes, sir, she responded automatically, getting up. She picked up her purse and headed for the door without the courage to look back. Charlotte, called Edward when she was about to leave. Yes? This stays between us. We don't need to feed unnecessary gossip. Of course, sir. I will never mention this to anyone. Upon leaving the suite, Charlotte felt that something had irrevocably changed. She couldn't explain it, but the impeccable professional relationship she maintained with Edward Vaughan now seemed charged with a different tension. And the worst part, the decisive meeting with the Japanese investors was about to happen, and she needed to maintain her composure, pretending she hadn't just woken up in her boss's bed. Walking hurriedly down the corridor, she wondered how she would face Edward in the coming hours. How would she look into the eyes of the man beside whom she had slept, even if involuntarily and without major consequences? And more disturbingly, why was a part of her, a small part that she would never admit, not completely sorry for this slip-up? With her heart racing and her mind in turmoil, Charlotte finally found room 512. Her real room. But as she opened the door, she knew nothing would be the same. The slip of one night had opened a door that she didn't know if she could close again. Charlotte had never showered so quickly in her entire life. The hot water ran down her body, but couldn't wash away the feeling of embarrassment that dominated her. Fragmented images returned to her mind, the dinner, the glasses of wine, the dark corridor, and finally, Edward Vaughan's surprised face waking her that morning. How could I have been so careless, she murmured to herself as she put on a navy blue suit and pulled her hair into a severe bun. She needed to look more professional than ever. The clock showed 7:15 a.m. The meeting with the representatives of Kimura Tech would begin at 9 cards. She had enough time to review the documents one last time and prepare the conference room. Work, that's what she needed to focus on now. Upon leaving the room, Charlotte took a deep breath. The corridor was empty, no sign of Edward or the other executives. In the elevator, she mentally rehearsed how she would behave when she met him. She would be professional, distant, as if nothing had happened. After all, nothing really had happened. Just an embarrassing but harmless mistake. The resort's restaurant was almost empty when she arrived for breakfast. She took a cup of strong coffee and sat at a discreet table in the corner, opening her tablet to review the presentations. Ready for today? The voice of Marcus Shaw, Nexus's financial director, startled her. He placed his plate of fruit on the table and sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. Totally, she replied, forcing a smile. I checked all the numbers last night. It seems the night was long, he commented with an enigmatic smile. I saw you when you got out of the elevator this morning. You looked concerned. Charlotte felt her stomach sink. Marcus was known for his nose for corporate gossip. Just anxious about the meeting, she replied, maintaining a professional tone. It's an important contract. No doubt, he agreed, taking a bite from a piece of papaya. Edward also seemed tense in the elevator, more than usual. Charlotte's heart accelerated. So Marcus had seen Edward too. Had he seen something else? Did other executives know she had left the CEO's suite that morning? Mr. Vaughan always takes business very seriously, she replied, trying to sound casual, especially when it comes to a contract of this size. Marcus studied her for a few seconds before shrugging. Of course. Business is business. His tone suggested there was something more to that observation, but Charlotte chose to ignore it. She finished her coffee quickly and stood up. I need to check the conference room. See you shortly. As she walked to the Atlantic room, Charlotte felt something was wrong. Small glances contained smiles from the resort staff, a different atmosphere. Or maybe it was just her paranoia, amplified by guilt and embarrassment. The room was impeccably arranged when she arrived. Tables arranged in a U shape, water and coffee served, folders with documents at each place. She checked the presentation, on the projector once more, and adjusted minimal details in the decoration. At 8:45, Nexus executives began to arrive. First Marcus, then Helen Crawford, the marketing director, followed by Ryan Dawson, the operations director. Everyone seemed especially animated, exchanging glances and smiles that Charlotte couldn't decipher. "Big day today, isn't it, Charlotte?" commented Helen with an almost maternal smile. The marketing director had always been kind to Charlotte, treating her like a protégé. "Yes, decisive," replied Charlotte, trying to focus on the professional aspects. "Is Edward coming yet?" asked Ryan, checking his watch. "I believe so," she answered, avoiding elaboration. The doors of the room opened, and Edward Vaughan entered, impeccable in his charcoal grey suit. His gaze briefly crossed with Charlotte's, but his expression remained impassive. "Good morning, everyone," he said, approaching the table. "The Kimura representatives are arriving now. Let's welcome them appropriately." The tension in the air was palpable, but Charlotte couldn't determine if it was due to the importance of the meeting or something else. The Japanese delegation arrived punctually at 9 Ms. Mr. Takashi Kimura, a man in his 60s, led the group of 5 executives. Introductions were made, business cards exchanged with the characteristic formality of the Japanese. The meeting began with Edward presenting Nexus's strategic vision for expansion in the Asian market. Charlotte observed everything from the side of the room, ready to intervene if necessary. She noticed that Kimura frequently looked from her to Edward, with a discreet smile that made her uncomfortable. During the coffee break, Charlotte approached Edward to hand him some updated documents. It was the first time they had been close since the incident. "Everything in order?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes, sir," she replied, equally discreet. "The numbers are impressing the Japanese." Edward nodded, but before he could say anything more, they were interrupted by Takashi Kimura. "Mr. Vaughan, I must congratulate you," said the Japanese man in impeccable English, "not only for the impressive results of your company, but also for the excellent choice of partners." The Japanese man's look passed significantly from Edward to Charlotte, making clear the double meaning of the word partners. Edward remained impassive. "Ms. Mitchell has been my executive assistant for 3 years. Her competence is fundamental to Nexus's success." Kimura smiled, making a small bow. "In Japan, we greatly value loyalty and closeness in professional relationships. I see that here it is no different." Charlotte felt her face burn. What exactly was Mr. Kimura insinuating, and how could he know something about the incident from the previous night? The meeting continued after the break, but Charlotte could barely concentrate. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the room. The Kimura executives seemed more relaxed, almost friendly. The Nexus directors exchanged significant glances when they thought no one was observing. At the end of the morning, when Takashi Kimura announced that he was very inclined to close the deal with Nexus, a collective sigh of relief went through the room. Edward maintained his usual composure, but a different gleam appeared in his eyes. "I suggest we celebrate this promising partnership with a dinner tonight," proposed Kimura. "And naturally, we expect the presence of all involved." His gaze rested significantly on Charlotte. "Certainly," replied Edward. "Ms. Mitchell will take care of all the arrangements." After the Japanese left, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The Nexus executives seemed to have abandoned formality, celebrating animatedly. "Edward, you dog," laughed Ryan, patting the CEO on the back. "It worked perfectly." Charlotte froze. What had worked? "What are you talking about?" asked Edward, tense. "Oh, don't play dumb," interrupted Marcus. "The news has already circulated throughout the resort. You and Charlotte. The shared room. The Japanese were very impressed with your vibrant personal life." Charlotte felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. The room spun slightly. How had that leaked? And so quickly? "Wait, what?" Helen looked from Marcus to Charlotte, intrigued. "What's this story?" "The maid saw Charlotte leaving Edward's room this morning," explained Marcus without trying to lower his voice. "It seems our CEO has finally broken his own rule of not getting involved with employees." "This is a complete misunderstanding," intervened Charlotte, trying to keep her voice firm despite the growing panic. "Regardless of what it is, continued Marcus. The Japanese loved it. Apparently, in their culture, a businessman with a vigorous personal life is seen as someone with great vitality and therefore reliable for partnerships. This is ridiculous, said Edward, with a coldness that made everyone in the room fall silent. My personal life is not under discussion, and it certainly had no influence on Kimura Tech's business decision. An awkward silence fell over the room. Charlotte wondered if she should explain what really happened, but that would only give more fuel to the gossip. "Excuse me," she said, collecting her documents. "I need to organize the details for dinner." She left quickly, feeling everyone's gazes fixed on her back. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, trying to contain tears of frustration. Her professional reputation was at risk, all because of a stupid mistake. She hadn't walked far when she felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Edward, with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to talk," he said, leading her to a small empty meeting room. He closed the door behind them and remained silent for a few seconds, as if organizing his thoughts. "I'm sorry about what happened in there," he began. "I didn't expect a private incident to turn into corporate gossip." "Neither did I," she replied, crossing her arms defensively. "And now? What do we do?" Edward walked to the window, observing the view of the sea for a moment before turning back to her. "Maybe we can use this to our advantage," he said. "Finally." Charlotte stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's evident that the Japanese have a peculiar perception of personal relationships and business. If they believe there's something between us, and that somehow makes them more comfortable with the partnership." "Are you suggesting we pretend to be in a relationship?" she asked, incredulous. Edward adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable with the conversation. "Only during this trip, until the contract is signed." Charlotte couldn't believe what she was hearing. Edward Vaughan, the man known for his inflexible ethics and unwavering professionalism, proposing such a charade. "This is completely unethical," she argued, "besides being potentially disastrous for my professional reputation, and for yours too. I'm not proposing anything improper," he clarified quickly, "just that we don't actively deny the rumors, that we appear together at dinner tonight, that we be friendly with each other in public. And afterwards? When we return to Chicago? How will we explain that suddenly we're no longer together?" Edward shrugged with a casualness that didn't suit him. "We'll say it was just a trip fling, or that we decided to keep our personal lives completely separate from the work environment." Charlotte shook her head, still incredulous. "I don't know, Edward. This seems wrong on so many levels." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, she realized belatedly. Something she had never done before, even after 3 years working side by side. A strange silence fell between them. Edward was looking at her differently now, as if he had also noticed the subtle change in the dynamic between them. "It's just a suggestion," he said finally. "I won't do anything without your full consent. If you prefer, I can talk to the directors and clarify the misunderstanding. As for the Japanese, well, we'll have to trust that the merit of our proposal is enough." Charlotte knew that Nexus needed that contract. Expansion into the Asian market had been Edward's goal for years, and now by a bizarre coincidence, she had unwittingly created a situation that could help realize that dream. "I'll think about it," she replied finally. "But regardless of what we decide, I want to make it clear that what happened was really an accident. I know," he interrupted softly. "I trust you, Charlotte. I always have." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. In 3 years, this was probably the most honest and vulnerable moment they had shared. "Thank you," she said, feeling strangely emotional. "I trust you too." Edward nodded, quickly regaining his composure. "Think about my proposal. Let me know before dinner." With that, he left the room, leaving Charlotte with more questions than answers. What was happening between them? Was it just a business strategy, or was there something more that neither of them was ready to admit? She looked out the window, watching the waves breaking on the beach. Her professional life had always been meticulously planned, each step carefully calculated, and now a simple room mistake had thrown everything into chaos. The most disturbing thing, however, was realizing that a part of her, a part that grew with each minute, wasn't entirely unhappy with this turn of events. The idea of pretending to be Edward Vaughan's partner, even if only for a few days, awakened feelings that she had been suppressing for a long time. As she left the room to organize the dinner, Charlotte made her decision. She would play this game, but with her own rules. If Edward Vaughan wanted a convincing partner to impress the Japanese, she would give him exactly that. And maybe, just maybe, she would discover if the coldness of the powerful CEO was just a facade for something deeper and more genuine. What had begun as an embarrassing room mistake was about to transform into something much more complex and dangerous, a game of appearances where real feelings could manifest when least expected. The resort's restaurant was decorated with Japanese lanterns and minimalist floral arrangements, a special touch to honor the visitors from Kimura Tech. Charlotte had personally taken care of every detail, immersing herself in work as a way to avoid thinking about the decision she had made hours earlier. Wearing a black dress she saved for special occasions, she was supervising the final preparations when she felt a presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Edward. "Everything is perfect," he commented, approaching. He wore a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and impeccable posture. "As always." Charlotte turned to face him, noticing how different he seemed at that moment, less the distant CEO, and more the man she had glimpsed briefly that morning. "Thank you," she replied, serene. "I thought about your proposal." Edward raised an eyebrow, expectant. "I'll do it," she continued. "We'll pretend whatever it is we're pretending, but I have my conditions." A discreet smile appeared on his lips. "I'm listening." "First, when we return to Chicago, we'll publicly clarify that there's nothing between us. Second, you'll guarantee that this won't affect my position in the company or my chances for future promotion." "Fair," he agreed without hesitation. "And third," she added, holding his gaze, "we need to establish clear boundaries. This is strictly professional, a business strategy, nothing more." Something indefinable passed through Edward's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, but he nodded. "Absolutely. Just professional." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the first guests. Helen Crawford entered the restaurant, elegant in a navy blue dress, followed by Marcus and Ryan. The three momentarily paused when they saw Edward and Charlotte talking close to each other, their faces just inches apart. "Looks like the night has already started well for some," commented Marcus maliciously. Charlotte felt her face heat up, but Edward, surprisingly, didn't move away. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her back, a gesture that would seem casual to any observer, but that sent shivers down her spine. "Marcus," said Edward, with studied calmness, "I suggest you focus your attention on the contract instead of personal matters. The Japanese will be here soon." The financial director raised his hands in surrender, but the knowing smile remained on his face. The Japanese delegation arrived punctually at 8. Takashi Kimura led the group, impeccable in a traditional suit. His eyes lit up upon seeing Charlotte beside Edward. "Mr. Vaughan, Ms. Mitchell," he greeted, making a small bow. "What a pleasure to see you again, and together." The way he emphasized the last word left no doubt as to what he was insinuating. "The pleasure is ours, Mr. Kimura," replied Edward, keeping his hand firmly on Charlotte's back. "We hope you enjoy this evening that we've prepared especially to celebrate our partnership." The scene was set, the actors in position, the show about to begin. Dinner was served at round tables that allowed for more intimate conversations. As expected, Edward and Charlotte sat with Takashi Kimura and his main assistant, Hiro Tanaka. Helen, Marcus, and Ryan occupied another table, with the other Japanese executives. The food was a fusion of American and Japanese cuisine, another detail carefully planned by Charlotte. Dishes like salmon sashimi with passion fruit, touches and briefly seared steak nigiri delighted the visitors. "Ms. Mitchell has exquisite taste," commented Kimura, savoring a tempura shrimp with mango sauce. "Now I understand why she conquered you, Vaughan-san." Edward smiled, casting a complicit look at Charlotte. Actually, she was the one who conquered me, he replied with surprising naturalness. Charlotte has the gift of seeing beyond appearances. It wasn't in the plans for Edward to elaborate so much on the charade, and Charlotte felt momentarily disconcerted. She had rehearsed answering direct questions, but wasn't prepared for this almost romantic Edward emerging before her. A rare quality, agreed Kimura. And how long have you been together? The question hung in the air for a tense moment. They hadn't agreed on a detailed story. It's complicated, intervened Charlotte, saving the situation. We've worked together for 3 years, but our personal relationship is recent. Ah, love in the workplace, sighed Kimura, nostalgic. I met my wife that way 40 years ago. She was my secretary. Times have changed quite a bit since then, commented Charlotte delicately. Today I'm an executive assistant with an MBA in international business. Impressive, replied Kimura with genuine admiration. Vaughn-san, you have good taste not only for business, but also for personal partnerships. The conversation flowed to business topics, allowing Charlotte to breathe more easily. Edward seemed absolutely at ease with the charade, answering questions and making occasional comments that suggested intimacy between them without crossing any inappropriate line. During dessert, a passion fruit mousse with dark chocolate sauce, Hiro, Tanaka, Kimura's assistant, leaned toward Charlotte. Miss Mitchell, if I may ask, what is it like working so closely with your partner? The question seemed innocent, but Charlotte knew she was being tested. She needed to find the right balance between honesty and the charade they were enacting. It's challenging, she replied, choosing each word carefully. The Edward I know at work is demanding, focused, sometimes relentless, but there are other sides to him that few know. She felt Edward's eyes on her, intense and questioning. Like what? Asked Tanaka, visibly interested. Charlotte looked directly at Edward as she answered. He's more sensitive than he appears, observant, capable of surprisingly gentle gestures when least expected. She wasn't lying, she realized. Despite the cold facade, Edward had shown understanding and respect for her on several occasions throughout the years. Small gestures that would go unnoticed by most, but that she had carefully registered. Something changed in Edward's expression, a momentary vulnerability, as if she had seen through a crack in his carefully constructed armor. Fascinating, commented Kimura, observing the exchange of glances between them. I knew there was something special here since our first meeting. The energy between you is, how do we say it? En no kirameki, the glow of a deep connection. The dinner proceeded with a few more rounds of sake and increasingly relaxed conversations. The charade seemed to be working perfectly. The Japanese were enchanted, the Nexus directors satisfied, and the contract seemed increasingly guaranteed. At one point, a small band began playing live music on the terrace adjacent to the restaurant. Kimura, already quite animated by the sake, suggested that everyone go to appreciate the view and the music. The terrace offered a spectacular view of the Hamptons Bay, with the moon reflecting on the calm waters. Some couples were already dancing to the soft sound of bossa nova. Vaughn-san, said Kimura with a mischievous smile, in Japan, we consider that a truly powerful man is not afraid to show affection in public. Would you dance with your beautiful partner for us? Edward hesitated for a very brief moment, looking at Charlotte. They hadn't discussed how far they would take the act. Would dancing together cross some invisible line that both had tacitly established? It would be a pleasure, he finally answered, extending his hand to Charlotte. She accepted, feeling his warm, firm palm against hers. Edward led her to the center of the terrace, where other couples were dancing. The band was playing The Girl from Ipanema in a soft, intimate arrangement. Are you okay with this? He asked in a low voice, as his hand found her waist. I am, replied Charlotte, surprising herself with her own sincerity. It's just a dance. But it wasn't just a dance, and they both knew it. As they moved gently to the rhythm of the music, something was changing between them. A tension that had been present for 3 years, carefully ignored and repressed, now emerging to the surface. Edward danced well, Charlotte noted with surprise. His movements were confident, elegant, without the rigidity she would expect from the man she knew in the office. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, genuinely curious. An enigmatic smile appeared on his lips. "Corporate etiquette. Classes. Believe it or not, knowing how to dance is still considered an important skill in the corporate world. You have many secrets, Edward Vaughan," she commented, allowing herself to relax in his arms. "We all do," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "You, for example, I never imagined you would be such a convincing actress." Charlotte laughed softly. "Neither did I." The music changed to something slower, more intimate. Edward brought her closer, almost instinctively. Now their bodies were separated by mere inches, his hand firm on her waist, hers resting on his shoulder. "Are they watching?" she asked, referring to the Japanese. "Yes," replied Edward after a quick glance over his shoulder. "Kimura seems especially satisfied." "Then we're succeeding," she concluded, trying to keep the conversation on safe, professional ground. Edward didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different tone, almost confessional. "You know what's strange, Charlotte? This doesn't feel as forced as it should." The comment caught her off guard. Her heart accelerated and she found herself at a loss for words for the first time that night. Because he was right, it didn't feel forced. Dancing with Edward, being in his arms, smelling his discreet masculine perfume, everything seemed strangely natural. "Maybe we're better actors than we thought," she finally replied, taking refuge in sarcasm. Edward gently spun her, bringing her back to his arms with a fluid movement that made her catch her breath. "Or maybe," he said, his lips dangerously close to her ear, "we're no longer acting." Before Charlotte could process the meaning of those words, she felt his hand on her chin, raising her face. Time seemed to slow down. Edward's eyes, always so controlled, now revealed something primitive, urgent. He kissed her. It wasn't a theatrical kiss, calculated to impress the observers. It was real, deep, intense, almost desperate, as if he had repressed that desire for a long time. Charlotte's hands instinctively grasped the lapel of his jacket, her body responding before her mind could protest. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Charlotte looked around, disoriented, only to find enthusiastic applause from the Japanese and knowing smiles from the Nexus directors. "This wasn't in the script," she whispered, trying to regain her balance. Edward kept his eyes fixed on hers without visible regret. Some of the best things in life aren't. The music ended, breaking the moment. Kimura approached, smiling broadly with a glass of champagne in each hand. "Magnificent, truly magnificent," he exclaimed, handing the glasses to them. "A toast to love and business, the two forces that move the world." Charlotte accepted the glass, grateful for the distraction. She needed time to process what had just happened. The kiss changed everything or changed nothing. Was it part of the act or something genuine? The rest of the night passed in a confused blur. More drinks, more conversations, more polite smiles and ambiguous comments. Charlotte remained close to Edward, as her role required, but avoided being alone with him again. Around midnight, Kimura announced that his team would retire to rest. "Tomorrow we will sign the papers," he declared, with the confidence of someone who has already made his decision. Nexus Technologies and Kimura Tech will be partners for many years. When the Japanese withdrew, followed by the Nexus directors, Charlotte finally allowed herself to exhale the air she didn't even know she was holding. She stayed there on the terrace, looking at the sea, trying to understand the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. "It worked," said Edward, standing a few steps away from her. "Kimura is completely convinced." She turned to face him, crossing her arms defensively. "Yes, the strategy worked perfectly." "Charlotte," he began, taking a step toward her. "No," she interrupted, raising her hand. "We don't need to discuss what happened." "It was an excellent performance, Edward, very convincing." He studied her in silence for a few seconds, his face an impenetrable mask. "Is that what you think it was? Just a performance?" "What else would it be?" she challenged, ignoring the tightness in her chest. Edward ran his hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability that she had never witnessed before. "I don't know." That's the question. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken words and unanswered questions. Charlotte knew they were in dangerous territory, not just for their careers but for their hearts. "Tomorrow we sign the contract," she finally said, opting for the safe ground of business. "Then we return to Chicago, and everything goes back to normal." "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice strangely soft. "To go back to normal?" Charlotte felt a wave of contradictory emotions. A part of her wanted to scream no, wanted to explore whatever this unexpected connection was that had emerged between them. But the rational part, the dedicated professional who had fought so hard for her position, knew that getting involved with the CEO was a risk she couldn't afford to take. "What I want doesn't matter," she finally replied. "We're adults, Edward. Professionals. What happened here was circumstantial." He nodded slowly, regaining his usual posture of controlled and distant CEO. "I understand. Well, in that case, I consider our mission accomplished. Good work, Ms. Mitchell." The sudden formality was like a slap. Charlotte felt a lump in her throat but kept her face impassive. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. Excuse me. I'll retire now." She turned and walked into the resort without looking back, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. In the elevator alone, she finally allowed herself to tremble, touching her lips where she could still taste him. What was happening to her? For years she had kept her feelings under perfect control, seeing Edward merely as the brilliant and distant boss who occasionally made her question if there was something more beyond that cold facade. And now, in less than 24 hours, all her careful control was crumbling. Upon reaching her room, the real one, number 512, Charlotte locked the door and leaned against it, sliding to the floor. Unexpected tears sprang to her eyes. The worst part wasn't the kiss or the confusion, or even the fear of what would come next. The worst was the sudden clarity that hit her like lightning. She was in love with Edward Vaughan. She had probably been for years denying it to herself, hiding behind professionalism and distance. And now that she had tasted what it could be like, how could she go back to what they were before? Her cell phone vibrated in her purse. A text message. With trembling fingers, Charlotte unlocked it. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m., final meeting with Kimura. Formal attire. Prepare for more theater. Edward." Theater. The word reverberated in her mind, like a sentence. For him, it was just that. A successful strategy, a well-played game. The kiss had been just another convincing element in the performance. Charlotte threw the phone on the bed and walked to the bathroom, facing her reflection. In the mirror, the slightly flushed face, the bright eyes, the lips still red from the kiss. "Wake up, Charlotte," she said to herself. "It was just a kiss, just business." But as she brushed her teeth and prepared for bed, a certainty formed in her heart. Nothing would be the same. The game of appearances had revealed truths that she wasn't ready to face, and tomorrow she would have to return to the stage, pretend that the kiss meant nothing, when in fact it had changed everything. The question that kept her awake until dawn was simple and devastating. How could she continue working alongside Edward, now that she knew exactly what she was missing? The contract signing was a formal and impeccable event, exactly as Charlotte had planned. In the resort's luxurious hall, Brazilian and Japanese executives sealed the agreement that would transform Nexus Technologies into a global company. Cameras recorded the historic moment. Edward Vaughan and Takashi Kimura shaking hands, satisfied smiles, champagne glasses raised in celebration. Charlotte observed everything from a safe distance, maintaining herself professional and efficient as always. No one who saw her could suspect the turbulent night she had spent, the tears shed, the unanswered questions that tormented her until dawn. Edward also acted as if nothing had happened. The cold, calculating CEO was back, with no traces of the vulnerable man who had kissed her the night before. He spoke confidently about international expansion and corporate synergy, while Charlotte took meticulous notes, as if documents and spreadsheets were the only safe territory at that moment. "A toast to the beginning of this partnership," declared Kimura, raising his glass after the final signature. "And a special thanks to Mr. Vaughan and his charming partner. who showed us that business and pleasure can indeed go hand in hand. Charlotte forced a smile as all eyes turned to her. Edward approached as the theatre they were still performing required, casually placing his arm around her waist. "The merit is all hers," replied Edward, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Charlotte is the true force behind Nexus." The words sounded empty, rehearsed. Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted this to end soon, for them to return to Chicago and bury that charade in the past. Even if that meant burying also whatever had awakened between them. After the final toasts, the invitations for future visits to Japan, and the last formalities, the Japanese delegation finally withdrew. The Nexus executives could barely contain their euphoria, a billion-dollar contract, ensuring the international expansion they had long aimed for. "Let's celebrate in grand style tonight," announced Marcus, already planning a celebration at the resort's bar. Everyone invited, including the couple of the moment. Charlotte felt her face burning. "Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend," she said quickly. "I need to organize our departure for tomorrow." "No way," protested Ryan. "You deserve to celebrate more than anyone. The contract is yours as much as ours." "Thank you, but—" "Ms. Mitchell is right," interrupted Edward, his firm voice leaving no room for discussion. "We still have a lot of work ahead. You can celebrate. We'll take care of the logistical details." The choice of the pronoun we didn't go unnoticed. Charlotte looked at Edward, trying to decipher his intention, but his face remained expressionless. The directors exchanged suggestive looks, but didn't insist. In a few minutes the room was empty, except for Charlotte and Edward. "You don't need to sacrifice your celebration," she said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "I can take care of everything alone." Edward studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "I'm not interested in celebrating with them," he finally replied. "We need to talk, Charlotte." Her heart accelerated. "About what exactly?" "You know about what." Charlotte looked away, pretending to organize documents. "The contract is signed. The charade can end now. There's nothing to discuss." "Look at me," he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes, meeting his. "Was it really just a charade?" Edward asked, taking a step toward her. Charlotte felt cornered not by him, but by her own emotions. How could she answer honestly without compromising everything she had worked for? "Edward, please," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. "We're adults, professionals. What happened here was circumstantial, as you yourself said." "I never said that." "Well, you implied it when you went back to calling me Ms. Mitchell right after kissing me." The words came out more bitter than intended. Edward seemed surprised by her frankness. "That was a mistake," he admitted, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his vulnerability. "I'm used to keeping people at a distance. It's easier that way." "Easier?" "For whom?" she challenged. Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, looking out at the Hamptons Bay. The silence extended between them, filled with tension and unspoken words. "Do you know why I never got involved with anyone from the company?" he asked, still with his back to her. "It's not just about professional ethics or fear of harassment lawsuits." Charlotte waited, feeling they were about to enter unknown territory. "It's because I lost my wife 6 years ago," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "Marion worked with me at the first startup I founded. We were young, in love, invincible, until she got sick." Edward turned to face her. His eyes, always so controlled, now revealed an old and deep pain. "Leukemia. In 6 months, she was gone. Since then, I've kept everyone at a distance, especially brilliant and dedicated women who could make me feel something again." Charlotte felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. In 3 years working with Edward, she never knew he had been married, never imagined the pain that hid behind that cold, controlled facade. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "I didn't know." "Few do. I prefer it that way. Easier to be the ruthless CEO everyone fears than the broken man they might pity." Something in the choice. Salve words bothered her. And which of these was real when you kissed me last night? Edward looked directly into her eyes. Neither, and both. When I'm with you, Charlotte, I don't know who I am anymore, and that terrifies me. The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Charlotte knew they were at a decisive moment. What, she said, now could change everything forever. I understand your fear, she began, choosing her words carefully. But I can't be an experiment, Edward. I can't be the person you use to discover if you're ready to feel something again. That's not what you represent to me, he protested, taking a step toward her. Then what do I represent? Because yesterday, it was a business strategy. Today I'm your confidant, and tomorrow we'll return to Chicago where you'll be my boss again. What's my role in this story, Edward? The question hung between them, challenging and honest. Charlotte realized that she had exposed not just his contradictions, but her own insecurities. I don't know, he admitted finally. I only know that when I entered that room and found you sleeping in my bed, something changed, as if the universe was giving me a sign that I could no longer ignore. Charlotte couldn't help a small, ironic smile. I never imagined you believed in signs from the universe. Neither did I, he replied, with a rare smile. Maybe I'm getting sentimental with age. The moment of lightness dissipated some of the tension. Charlotte felt safer to ask what she really wanted to know. What happens now, then? Edward took another step toward her, reducing the distance between them. That depends on both of us. We can return to Chicago and pretend none of this happened, or, she encouraged when he hesitated. Or we can give a chance to whatever this is between us. No audience, no business strategies, just you and me, discovering if there's something real here. Charlotte's heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. The proposal was tempting and terrifying at the same time. Getting involved with the CEO could compromise everything she had professionally achieved, but refusing could mean losing something that had barely begun to understand. And if we give it a chance and it doesn't work, she asked, exposing her biggest fear. How would we continue working together? Like adults, he replied simply, with mutual respect and professionalism. I'm not an impulsive man, Charlotte. If I'm proposing this, it's because I believe it's worth the risk. She was about to respond when her cell phone vibrated. An urgent email from one of the Japanese investors. Something about contract details that needed to be clarified immediately. We need to resolve this, she said, showing him the message. The personal conversation will have to wait. Edward nodded, quickly returning to professional mode. Of course, work first, as always. For hours, they immersed themselves in the bureaucracy of the newly signed contract, clarifying clauses, sending additional documents, making calls to the legal team in Chicago. The familiarity of this routine was comforting to Charlotte. Here was the safe ground she knew so well. They worked side by side in Edward's presidential suite, temporarily transformed into an office. The personal tension had been temporarily suspended, replaced by the professional dynamic they had perfected over the years. It was already night when they finally resolved all the pending issues. Charlotte rubbed her tired eyes, feeling the weight of the day and the previous sleepless night finally catching up with her. You should rest, commented Edward, noticing her fatigue. We have an early flight tomorrow. You too, she replied, gathering her documents. It was quite a day. He smiled slightly. Yes, it was. A strange silence settled between them. The interrupted conversation still hung in the air, asking for conclusion. Edward, she began, gathering courage, about what we were discussing before. He looked at her expectantly, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. I need time, continued Charlotte. This all happened very fast. In less than 48 hours, we went from boss and assistant to whatever we are now. I need to process all of this. Edward nodded slowly. I understand. Time is something I can offer. Thank you, she said, feeling a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of her wanted him to insist more, to show more urgency, but another part deeply appreciated his respect for her space. When we return to Chicago, he began, leaving the sentence unfinished. When We return to Chicago, we'll be professionals as always, she completed. And in parallel, maybe we can explore these other possibilities. A genuine smile illuminated his face. Seems like a sensible plan, Ms. Mitchell. The formal use of her surname now had a touch of irony, almost of intimacy. Charlotte smiled in response. Good night, Mr. Vaughan, she said goodbye, heading for the door. Charlotte, he called before she left. When she turned, he seemed undecided, as if debating with himself about what to say. Finally, he opted for simplicity. Thank you. For what? For making me feel something again. The words accompanied her down the corridor to her room, echoing in her mind as she prepared for bed. Behind the facade of the powerful CEO was a man marked by loss, fearful of opening up again. And somehow she had managed to cross that barrier. The problem, Charlotte realized as she finally fell asleep, was that she didn't know if she was ready for the responsibility that represented. The next morning brought with it a return to normality. Packed bags, organized documents, formal goodbyes to the Japanese executives. At the airport, the Nexus team seemed exhausted but satisfied. The billion-dollar contract had been closed. Mission accomplished. On the flight back to Chicago, Charlotte sat with Helen, while Edward occupied first class with the directors. The physical separation seemed symbolic, back to their respective places in the corporate hierarchy. So, began Helen, as soon as the plane took off, you and Edward Vaughan. Who would have thought? Charlotte forced a polite smile. It's not quite what it seems, Helen. You don't need to be discreet with me, insisted the marketing director, lowering her voice. I saw the kiss on the terrace. That wasn't acting. Charlotte felt her face heat up. It's complicated. It always is, replied Helen with an understanding smile. You know, when I started at Nexus, Edward was different, less controlled. After Marion passed away, he changed completely. The mention of Edward's late wife's name surprised Charlotte. You knew her? Yes, we worked together for almost 2 years, replied Helen, a touch of nostalgia in her voice. Marion was brilliant, passionate about what she did. Very similar to you, actually. The words hit Charlotte like a punch. Was that why Edward had kept his distance for so long? Because she reminded him of his late wife? I'm not suggesting he sees you as a replacement, clarified Helen, noticing her discomfort. I'm just saying you awakened something in him that we all thought had died with Marion, a capacity for genuine connection. Charlotte remained silent, absorbing that information. She wanted to ask more about Marion, about Edward before the tragedy, but something stopped her. It seemed invasive, almost voyeuristic. Whatever is happening between you two, continued Helen gently, I can only say that I've never seen Edward look at someone the way he looks at you, not even at Marion. The rest of the flight passed, in a haze of confused thoughts for Charlotte. When they finally landed in Chicago, she felt emotionally exhausted. In the airport lobby, the executives said their goodbyes, each going their own way. Edward approached her briefly. Rest today, he said, professional as always. Tomorrow we have a lot of work ahead. Yes, sir, she responded automatically. Something like disappointment quickly crossed his eyes. Dinner Friday? He asked. Then, lowering his voice, to continue our conversation. The invitation caught Charlotte by surprise, even after everything they had discussed. The reality of the situation finally hit her. Edward Vaughan, the powerful CEO for whom she had always harbored a secret admiration, was really interested in her. Friday sounds great, she agreed, trying to maintain her outer calm despite her racing heart. An almost smile appeared on his face. Excellent, I'll send the details later. And so they separated, he to his penthouse in the Gold Coast, she to her modest apartment in Lincoln Park, back to their very different worlds, connected only by the promise of a possibility. The days that followed were strangely normal. At Nexus, the mood was one of contained celebration for the contract with the Japanese, but routine soon resumed its usual rhythm. Charlotte and Edward maintained their usual professionalism, meetings, reports, phone calls. No one who saw them could suspect the unresolved tension between them. On Thursday, Charlotte found herself alone in the office, organizing old documents for archiving. Most of the employees had already gone home, and the silence was comforting after a busy day. One particular folder caught her attention, simply labeled Personal EV. It was stored in the back of a rarely used drawer. Normally, Charlotte would never open something clearly marked as personal, but something compelled her, perhaps the need to better understand the man who had confessed his feelings to her. Inside the folder, she found various documents: Edward and Marion's marriage certificate, some photographs, newspaper clippings about Nexus's first successes, and then something that made her blood freeze: detailed reports on various company employees, including herself. The report on Charlotte was extensive: her complete academic history, previous jobs, family situation, even details about the small apartment she had bought with such sacrifice. There were handwritten notes in the margins, in Edward's unmistakable handwriting. "Excellent potential," said one note. "History of overcoming. Possible candidate." The document was dated 4 years ago, a year before she was hired by Nexus. Charlotte felt her stomach sink. Edward had investigated her life long before meeting her. He knew everything about her even before the first interview. He had planned to hire her based on this information. But why? And how did this relate to his current feelings? Had everything been planned from the beginning? Would the accident in the hotel room really be a coincidence, or part of an elaborate game? With trembling hands, Charlotte put the documents back exactly as she had found them. Her mind worked frantically, trying to fit this disturbing revelation into the puzzle that was Edward Vaughan. The next day, the day of the promised dinner, she could barely concentrate on work. Edward had gone out for external meetings, which was a relief. She didn't know if she could face him without confronting him about her discovery. At 5 in the afternoon, she received a message from him. 9 p.m. the Maple Room. I'll come by to pick you up at 8:30. Charlotte looked at the message for long minutes. One of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. A real date, not a continuation of their charade in the Hamptons. It was really happening. But now a new question tormented her mind. Who was Edward Vaughan really? The vulnerable man who had confessed his fear of feeling again, or the calculating strategist who had investigated her life even before meeting her? And more importantly, could she trust her own feelings for someone who seemed to hide so many secrets? As she closed her laptop and prepared to go home to get ready, Charlotte knew that the dinner that night would be decisive, not just for a possible relationship, but for her future at Nexus and perhaps for her own peace of mind. The revelation of the secret files had changed everything. What had begun as a room mistake and evolved into an unexpected attraction was now complicated by doubts and suspicions. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them, regardless of the consequences. With this firm resolution in mind, Charlotte left the office, not knowing that the approaching night would bring even more surprising revelations and choices that would change her life forever. Charlotte's red dress contrasted with the elegant interior of the black car that Edward had sent to pick her up. She had opted for something bold, different from her usual choices, not just to impress him, but to remind herself that this night was not about executive assistant Charlotte Mitchell, but about the woman who existed beyond the professional role. On the way to the restaurant, she mentally rehearsed various approaches to confront him about the files she had found. Direct and accusatory, subtle and strategic, nothing seemed adequate for the complexity of the situation. The Maple Room, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago, was illuminated by soft lights when she arrived. In the center of the main hall, the famous maple tree extended its majestic branches, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The maitre d' led her to a discreet table, away from the other customers. Edward was already waiting for her, impeccable in a dark suit. Upon seeing her, he immediately stood up, his eyes traveling over the red dress with evident admiration. "You look stunning," he said, pulling out the chair for her to sit. "Thank you," replied Charlotte, trying to maintain her composure, despite the whirlwind of contradictory emotions she felt. "The place is amazing." "I thought we deserved something special," he commented, sitting back. down. To mark our new beginning. The choice of words didn't go unnoticed. New beginning suggested a new page, an attempt to leave behind the previous roles of boss and subordinate. In other circumstances, Charlotte would have been touched. Now she just wondered how much of this new beginning had been meticulously planned. The sommelier approached to present the wine list, but Edward had already selected a bottle. As the wine was served, they talked about neutral subjects: the contract with the Japanese, the weather, the chef's reputation. The familiarity of professional conversation was safe ground, a prelude to what really mattered. It was only after the first course, a scallop carpaccio with Sicilian lemon, that Edward finally abandoned the formalities. "I missed you today," he confessed, surprising her with his direct honesty. "It's strange considering we've worked in the same building for 3 years, but after the Hamptons it seems like everything has changed." Charlotte took a sip of wine, seeking courage. "Many things changed indeed. I discovered some things about you that I didn't know before." Edward nodded, assuming she was referring to his wife's story. "I know I should have told you about Marion before. It's not something I usually share, but you deserve to know." "I'm not just talking about Marion," said Charlotte, looking directly into his eyes. "I'm talking about the files, the investigations you did on me and other employees." Edward's face subtly transformed. Her shadow of surprise, quickly replaced by a controlled expression that she knew so well. "You found the reports," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "Yes, by chance. I was archiving old documents." Edward took a deep breath, putting his utensils aside. "I was going to tell you, tonight actually." "Why did you wait so long?" she questioned, trying to control the hurt in her voice. "Why investigate my life before even meeting me?" He took a sip of wine as if seeking the right words. "After Marion was gone, I became obsessive with control. I needed to know everything about the people around me, especially those who would work closely with me." "That doesn't justify digging into my personal life," retorted Charlotte. "My academic history, my financial situation, even my family history?" "No," he agreed, surprising her. "It doesn't justify it. It was an invasion of privacy, even if done by legal means. At the time I rationalized it as a necessary precaution. Today I see it was excessive." The frank admission disconcerted her. She expected denial, elaborate justifications, not this direct acceptance of impropriety. "There were notes about me," she continued, remembering the most disturbing details. "Excellent potential, history of overcoming, possible candidate." "Candidate for what exactly?" Edward kept his gaze steady, without diverting from her accusing eyes. "For the position of executive assistant." "Just that?" she pressed. "Or were there other plans, because it seems strangely convenient that you investigated me 4 years ago, hired me, maintained a strictly professional relationship for 3 years, and suddenly, after an incident in the Hamptons, developed feelings for me." The insinuation hung between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Edward seemed genuinely disturbed. "Charlotte," he said, leaning forward, "I believe you know me well enough to know that I'm not the type of man who elaborates long-term romantic schemes." "I thought I knew you," she replied. "But the man I knew wouldn't secretly investigate his employees." Edward closed his eyes for a moment as if gathering strength. When he reopened them, there was a rare vulnerability in his gaze. "After Marion got sick, I lost control of everything. I couldn't prevent the disease. I couldn't save her. It was devastating. When I finally managed to rebuild the company, and myself, I vowed that I would never again be in a position of impotence. Information was control. Knowing everything about everyone around me gave me the illusion that I could predict and avoid tragedies." Charlotte listened in silence, moved, despite the distrust. "I investigated dozens of candidates," he continued. "You stood out not just for your impressive resume, but for your resilience. Raised by a single mother, scholarships earned by merit, consistent professional ascension. Someone who doesn't easily give up, who doesn't get discouraged by adversities. So, you hired me because you thought I would be resistant to tragedies?" she asked, trying to understand his logic. "I hired you because you were the most qualified," corrected Edward. The resilience was a bonus. I needed someone strong by my side, professionally speaking. The waiter brought the main course, grilled sea bass for her, filet for him, momentarily interrupting the conversation. When they were alone again, Charlotte resumed the subject. And what changed in the Hamptons? Why, after 3 years of maintaining emotional distance, are you suddenly interested in something more? Edward considered the question for a moment, as if seeking the answer within himself. When I entered that room and saw you sleeping in my first reaction was panic, not due to the possible embarrassment, but because something inside me had awakened. Something I had buried with Marion. The possibility of connection. He paused, taking another sip of wine. I tried to ignore it. I went back to the script of The Ruthless CEO. But when Marcus mentioned the rumors, when I realized we could use that to our advantage in business, it was as if the universe was giving me an excuse to get closer to you, without admitting the real reason. And what was the real reason? Asked Charlotte, her heart accelerating despite the doubts. That I had been fighting against my attraction to you for a long time. Maybe from the beginning, but I didn't allow these feelings to even form consciously. The raw honesty of the confession disarmed her. If it was manipulation, it was extraordinarily convincing. How can I trust you now? She asked, putting into words her biggest fear. How can I know that this isn't just another strategy, another level of control? Edward extended his hand across the table, not touching hers but offering himself for her to decide. You can't be certain, he admitted. No one can be absolutely certain about another person's feelings. What I can offer is transparency from now on. No secrets, no investigations. Just me with all my flaws, trying to rediscover what it's like to care about someone without fear of losing everything again. Charlotte looked at his extended hand, feeling the weight of the decision. There were enough reasons to get up and leave that restaurant, to end any possibility of a relationship beyond the professional. The invasion of privacy was not something that could be easily forgiven. But there was also the undeniable connection between them, something that transcended logic and prudence. The man before her was not just CEO Edward Vaughan, but someone deeply marked by suffering, trying to find a way back to life. Helen told me a little about Marion, said Charlotte finally. She said she was brilliant and passionate about her work, like me. Edward nodded, a shadow of pain crossing his face. There are similarities, yes, but you're not her. And that's not what I'm looking for. Are you sure? Pressed Charlotte. Am I not replacing someone you lost? Marion was my past, he replied firmly. A precious past that I will always honor. But if there's something I learned from her loss, it's that life is too unpredictable and brief to waste opportunities for genuine connection. The waiter approached to check if they needed anything, but Edward dismissed him with a discreet gesture. I'm asking for a chance, Charlotte, he continued when they were alone again. Not as your boss, not as the man who improperly investigated your past, but as someone who sees in you not just an exceptional professional, but an extraordinary woman who awakens in me feelings that I thought I would never have again. Charlotte looked at the hand still extended on the table. Her entire life had been built on carefully calculated decisions, measured risks, meticulous planning. What Edward proposed was a leap into the unknown, with all possible consequences, good and bad. Slowly she extended her own hand, covering his with her fingers. I'm willing to try, she finally said, but with one condition. Which one? He asked, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and hope. Total transparency, as you said, and that includes destroying all those reports about me and any other employee. The past is the past. If we're going to try something new, it has to be on different foundations. Edward gently squeezed her hand. Consider it done. That simple touch, hand over hand on a restaurant table, sealed not just an agreement, but the beginning of a possibility that neither had included in their carefully elaborated life plans. The following weeks were a delicate exercise in balancing the professional and the personal. At Nexus, they maintained absolute discretion. He still the demanding CEO, she still the impeccable executive assistant. But outside the office, they explored this new dimension of their relationship with caution and mutual discovery. Dinners at discreet restaurants, walks through Millennium Park on weekends, conversations that extended into the early morning, slowly. They built an intimacy that transcended the roles they had played for so long. 1 month after the dinner at the Maple Room, Edward invited Charlotte to see his home, an elegant penthouse in the Gold Coast with a panoramic view of the city. The place perfectly reflected his personality, sophisticated, minimalist, with some surprisingly welcoming touches. "You're the first woman I've invited here since Marion," he confessed as they served themselves wine on the glass-enclosed veranda. Charlotte felt the weight of those words. "Thank you for the trust." "I want to show you something," said Edward, leading her to an office in the corner of the apartment. On the desk was a simple cardboard box. He opened it, revealing several folders, the reports that had investigated not just Charlotte, but dozens of other Nexus employees. "As promised," he said, handing her a lighter, "all the past, for you to destroy." The symbolic gesture touched her deeply. It wouldn't be practical to burn all the documents there in the penthouse, but the intention was clear. Edward was giving her control over what represented his most questionable behavior. "We can shred them tomorrow," she suggested, returning the lighter. "The important thing is that you were willing to do this." That night, for the first time, she didn't return home. She fell asleep in Edward's arms, with the illuminated city extending below them like a sea of earthly stars. It wasn't perfect, nor easy. There were moments of doubt, of adjustments, of learning to navigate the strange dynamic of being both professional colleagues and intimate partners. But there was also an authenticity that neither had experienced before, the freedom to be their truest versions, with all the complexities and imperfections. 3 months later, during a meeting with the Nexus directors, Edward made a surprising announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have 2 pieces of news to share," he began with his usual formality. "First, our partnership with Kimura Tech has surpassed all projections. The Asian market accounts for 30% of our current revenue, with an expectation of growth to 45% by the end of the year." Enthusiastic applause filled the meeting room. "Second, news," he continued, his gaze briefly meeting Charlotte's, seated discreetly in the corner of the room. "I am promoting Ms. Charlotte Mitchell to the position of Director of International Relations, effective immediately." A surprised silence preceded the polite applause. Charlotte maintained a professional expression, but her heart raced. This promotion wasn't in the plans discussed between them. "Considering our personal relationship," proceeded Edward, surprising everyone with his frankness, "Ms. Mitchell will report directly to the board, not to me, eliminating any conflict of interest." Her competence during the negotiations with Kimura Tech demonstrated that she is the ideal person to expand our global presence. After the meeting, when they finally were alone, Charlotte confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me about the promotion?" "Beforehand?" she asked, divided between gratitude and concern. "People will think I got this because of our relationship." Edward smiled, that rare smile that she now saw more frequently. "First, because you deserve it on your own merit. Second, because the simultaneous announcement of the promotion and our relationship clearly establishes that we have nothing to hide. And third," he added, approaching to kiss her softly, "because I wanted to see the expression on your face when you realize that we can finally stop pretending in the office." Charlotte laughed, understanding the strategy. It was typical of Edward, always thinking several steps ahead. "Still, you should have consulted me," she insisted, though without real irritation. "Some control habits are hard to break," he admitted with disarming honesty. "I'm learning." And he was, really. The Edward who had emerged in recent months was a man in transformation, still determined and focused, but also more open, more willing to share not just decisions, but vulnerabilities. 1 year after the incident in the Hamptons, the room mistake that had changed everything, Edward took her back to the same resort. He requested the same suite, 710, and reserved a table on the terrace where they had danced, under the stars. "Why come back here?" asked Charlotte as they appreciated the view of the bay, now familiar but no less breathtaking. "To close a circle," he replied, his gaze lighter than she had ever seen. And to begin another. It was then that he knelt, taking from his pocket not a traditional jewelry box, but something much more significant, a ring made by hand, imperfect in its form, but deeply personal. "I made it myself," he explained before, her surprised look. "In an artisanal jewelry workshop, 6 classes to learn the basics. It turned out crooked, I know." Charlotte observed the silver ring with a small sapphire set in a slightly asymmetrical way. It was absolutely imperfect and completely wonderful. "I chose to make it this way," continued Edward, "because our story also began. Crooked, imperfect. A room mistake, a contract, a charade that became real. Nothing happened as it should, and yet we arrived exactly where we needed to be." Unexpected tears sprang to Charlotte's eyes. This was not the Edward Vaughan that the corporate world knew, the ruthless CEO, the cold strategist. This was the man that only she fully knew, with his emotional scars, his fears, his surprising capacity to begin again. "Marry me?" he asked simply. "Not because it's strategically advantageous, not because it makes professional sense, but because in these months I realized that I don't want to imagine my life without you." Charlotte extended her left hand, allowing him to slide the imperfect ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Yes," she replied with the same simplicity, "because sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the best decisions." He stood up and kissed her, not like that first time, a kiss loaded with uncertainty and contained desire, but with the tranquil security of someone who has unexpectedly found a home. They married 6 months later, in an intimate ceremony, at a friend's vineyard outside Chicago. Charlotte wore a simple cream silk dress, Edward a navy blue suit without a tie. No ostentation, no grand productions, just the authenticity they had built together. Among the guests were Helen, who openly cried during the vows, Marcus, who didn't miss the opportunity to remind everyone that he saw the potential since the Hamptons, and to the surprise of many, Takashi Kimura, who traveled from Japan especially for the ceremony. "In my country," said the Japanese man during his toast, "we believe that some connections are predestined, written in the stars long before the first meeting. What seems like chance is, in fact, inevitability." Edward and Charlotte exchanged a complicit smile. Whether destiny or mere chance, the mistake that had united them had transformed into the most significant decision of their tours. 5 years later, Nexus Technologies had become a global power with offices on 3 continents. Charlotte commanded international operations with the same competence she had previously demonstrated as an executive assistant. Edward, although still CEO, had learned to delegate more, to trust more, to live more. In their new home, a spacious property on the outskirts of Chicago, away from the frantic rhythm of the city, they had created a space that reflected who they really were beyond the corporate roles. A home. On a Sunday afternoon, while Edward prepared a barbecue in the garden, a newly discovered skill that delighted him, Charlotte observed their 3-year-old daughter running on the grass, chasing soap bubbles. Marion, a name chosen not with grief but with respect and continuity, had her father's determined eyes and her mother's easy smile. She was living proof that the past didn't need to be forgotten for a new future to be built. "What are you thinking about?" asked Edward, approaching with 2 glasses of wine. "About how it all began," she replied, accepting the glass. "A wrong room, a misunderstanding, a charade. And here we are," he completed, sitting beside her. "I think we should send a thank you card to that maid, who wrongly programmed the key cards." Charlotte laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if I hadn't confused the room numbers that night." "We would have found another way," replied Edward with conviction. "Maybe less dramatic, certainly less embarrassing, but I believe we would have gotten here anyway." She raised her glass in a small toast. "To mistakes that transform into the best decisions." Edward touched his glass to hers, his eyes reflecting a peace that no one would have imagined possible years ago. "And to wrong rooms that lead us to the right place." Under the setting sun of Chicago, surrounded by the sound of their daughters' laughter, They sealed once more the silent promise they had made in that suite in the Hamptons to transform the unexpected into extraordinary, the imperfect into precious, and each day, with its mistakes and decisions, into a shared adventure. For you who followed this journey between Charlotte and Edward, thank you very much. This story of unexpected encounters and new beginnings reminds us that sometimes life's greatest decisions begin with small mistakes. If you were moved by this narrative, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the surprising paths of the heart. In the comments, tell us, have you ever experienced a mistake that ended being the beginning of something extraordinary in your life? Your story could be the next to inspire thousands of people. Come back next week for a new narrative that promises to touch your heart in the same way.